Hello, everybody. It's Marcy from wavesofcommunication.com. Welcome to another episode of the Language Facilitation Helpline podcast, and thank you for tuning in today. Every action you take to help the late talkers in your life is important, that the fastest results come when you enjoy the process of language facilitation. Hi, everybody. It's Marcy from wavesofcommunication.com, and I am here with another spotlight interview for you. I have with me today Beth Linsfield, who is an OT, and she is also very passionate about teaching parents how to educate through the IEP process. So as a new occupational therapist in the schools, Beth was overwhelmed by the IEP process. I know this for a fact. I know that all the speech therapists out there are too. And then after participating in more than 80 IEP meetings a year, which is not uncommon for people who work in the schools, she noticed how some parents innately inspired their IEP school team to provide their very best quality IEP and plan and services, which is the best role for a parent. And after taking some online parent course herself, she searched for an online resource to send her parents to help them, and she couldn't find one. So she made it herself, which is amazing, and she's here to share it with us today. So welcome, Beth. I'm so happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm so excited to be here and to share this and just help parents in general with this IEP process. I started out as an adaptive horseback riding instructor. So I worked in several different states in humongous centers and helping parents have really quality experiences for their kids in being able to ride horses. And there's so much communication that happens with the human and animal bond, and I just absolutely loved it. Through that experience, I actually found occupational therapy a little bit later in life, and I just had all of those experiences bringing me into OT school. I always knew that I wanted to end up in schools. I did a little bit of early intervention. I did a little bit of outpatient work, and then I eventually landed in the schools. And when I first got there, I was so overwhelmed and confused about the IEP process. There, as you know, there's a whole different jargon and culture. There's terms that everybody uses within the culture of the school that nobody else outside of that culture understands. It's very intimidating.
There's a lot of fear, and we were just talking about this before. I hate to jump in, but this idea of you against me and this table between us and the opposite ends of it, that's really part of, why I like having an occupational therapist, someone who's been on both sides of the table, somebody who worked with parents to help with this. So, yeah. So as you're working with parents, now we were talking before I cut you off. Tell me a little bit more quick. You evolved from horseback to OT, which is also very interesting. One of my clients in the Waves of Communication community is an OT who is moving into horse training, because it's so interesting how they work together, right? And I also loved how much you talked about communication with horses. So we could do a whole video just on that.
We could.
But I really want to get onto this IEP part, because I know that's why parents are tuning in. And so what we were talking about is, with language facilitation, it's a very natural process. Yes. And kids go into schools now who are not using their best spoken language at all. I mean, some of them aren't talking at all. Some of them are talking, they're using echolalia. Some of them are, they're all ranges, of course, of kids that are going in there. And one of the things that our parents are consistently struggling with schools is placement, right? That's always what people are worried about, placement and how to, get their kid in the right place. But really, it's all about experience that I'm trying to help them. So can you talk a little bit about IEP and placement, and, how when a parent is getting there, and we're talking about all that, I probably jumping the gun, but I really want to ask this question.
Yeah, inclusion is a really, really hot topic right now for a good reason. And I always say that IEPs are so amazing and so complicated and hard because they're personalized, right? You can't model your kid's IEP off of anybody else's IEP because their needs are very different from anybody else's, even with the same medical diagnosis, even with the same situation with being a late talker. That IEP is totally different from person to person. So even parents that try to network with each other, which I totally encourage, they're going to have different priorities and needs for their own kid. And inclusion is one of those things. There are kids who very much care about being with peers, and they pick up on that so well, just like a lot of the parents that use your system and your strategies. They want their kids to be around in that general education classroom and be included in those classrooms so they get more exposure. And then there are some kids that don't benefit from that. Maybe they get overwhelmed by that big classroom. Those are all different dynamics that are different person to person. When you're coming in and trying to ask for more inclusion, I think it's really important to give your why. So many parents come in, especially parents that kind of come in with the result in mind, but not the why. So they come in saying, I want more OT minutes. I want more speech minutes, but they're not saying why or what that's going to facilitate for them. So I think having a really clear reason of why you want those things is incredible. And I think your website in particular is such a good resource to point the school team towards, because it explains why they're asking for these things, right? They're saying, hey, I'm following Marcy's program. This is what she believes. It's working at home. We're seeing it. You mentioned that in your workbook, they're taking data. That's amazing to bring to the meeting. Why it's so important to try to be as comfortable as possible in that meeting and have year-round communication so that there's not as much pressure on that one individual meeting.
Yeah. Wow. So that's a big deal. It's a big deal. And it's all about, we're talking about a meeting here, a communication to create a plan for the child's year, and the idea is we don't get that information all in one moment, in one situation. We're reviewing the entire year, it not only the experiences that have been happening in the school, but the experiences that are happening at home. And I think, first of all, when you have a team that's open to seeing those things, let's talk about creating that relationship, because, when I talk about language facilitation and all the strategies that I give, it's not just about in this moment. It's about what happened before, what happens now, and what are we creating, the path moving forward, the trajectory, the possibilities. Because again, we don't know how any of this is going to come out. It's a plan, So that's again what you have in your mind is it is a plan, not it is the recipe to the solution that you want in your mind. And I think that's where a lot of parents get off on, even in my workbook, is they think this is a step-by-step process. All I've got to do is mix these things together and my kid's going to talk. And it's not, we're talking about humans in environments that change, in teams of people. There's no way that one recipe is going to work for every child, right? That's why, again, we can't look at the book or somebody else's or whatever, but it's important to see the whole thing and create the relationships. So who are the most important people that the parent communicates with from the very first time they enter the school to make sure that this team is created of people who are aware and knowledgeable about their child? Who are the people they need to talk to? Let's start there.
So there's two key people. There's the case manager, which in the schools it depends on what eligibility criteria they fit underneath. It's either going to be a special education teacher, or if they have a speech-only IEP, it's going to be a speech-language pathologist. That's their case manager. There's another, if they're deaf and hard of hearing, there might be a couple other people that might be the lead of that team, but those are the most common people that would be their case manager. And those are the people who really help craft that plan moving forward. So they're really key people to get on your team and to have their ears so that you can communicate really well with them. The second person is really the principal of the school. And they set the tone for the rest of the staff. So if you're really advocating for inclusion, then that general education teacher is going to take the lead of that policy of inclusion and the way that they include those kids from the principal. So the principal really sets that tone for inclusion and the expectations for the general education teacher throughout the years, right? The general education teacher is also a really important person to communicate with, but I really feel like if you're going to focus on just a couple people to really communicate well with, that should be the principal and the case manager of your kids' IEP.
So it starts with back and forth communication. First of all, don't go in saying this is what we want.
Mm-hmm.
Because they have a building, right? They have a school, they have ways they work, systems and policies.
Yes.
You are taking your child and giving your child to the care of these people. And they have ways that they go about doing it at their school, no matter what kind of school it is.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first thing you do is when you go see what the environment's about, create relationships so that there's mutual understanding to start with. And then, like I said, sharing what you're doing. I love that you said that you suggested that. If you're collecting data, video or workbook data about your late talker, then you show up with those things in a way, not that you want to make the school adapt to you, but in a way that you want to integrate with what's going on there, because what's going on there isn't going to change. You're going to have to find a way to help your child be successful at that school. It's still your responsibility as a parent to make your child successful in the school. I realize that the school needs to meet your child's needs. You know, that's important. But I think the idea of expectations is a real a talking point here, right? Where,
yes, absolutely.
You know, what parents should expect, I think what they reasonably can expect is that the school will listen to them and the school will take their feedback into consideration when they make their plans, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think a really good thing to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about your amazing strategies, is that a lot of even special education teachers have a lot of education in how to teach literacy or math, and they go to the continuing education of the whole building. So they're going to the continuing education that's provided by the district to general education teachers and not necessarily getting a ton of updates and education about what new strategies are out there and what's working. So that really comes from the parent to say, hey, I found this great strategy. We've been doing it at home. It's working in the community. Check this out. Here's some resources. And I know that's exhausting. I know that that's an additional layer of advocacy that just seems like it's overwhelming sometimes, but having that consistent communication year round, I have a bunch of different strategies that I talk about in ways to communicate that throughout the year. So it's not so like pressure filled when you get to that meeting. And that team already knows going into that meeting, oh, they do this kind of strategy at home. Can we teach our paras how to do it? Can we learn more about it? Can it get integrated into that plan? Because if you're trying to do that just at the meeting, it's not going to go very well because there's a lot of stress on the school team to get the paperwork done, to slog through that, to get it set up, to change para schedules. There's a lot of change going on at that meeting. So if you're able to talk about those strategies year round and really educate your team about what's working for them and provide that data throughout the year, it goes so much further and it's so much less stressful for parents and for the school team that they know if they give a little bit and you give a little bit, then all of a sudden we have the child at the center and that's what we all want anyway.
I love that. And that's,
Mhm.
again, what we're talking about here is strategies to help you be successful. It starts way before the IEP meeting. It starts when you first show up at the school. You know what I mean? And you're starting to get to know them. Can you tell us a few more of the strategies? You talked about ways that you have for parents to connect. Can you talk about some of those things?
Yes, absolutely. So there's kind of two different ways that I'm seeing a lot of things happen, right? Is the paper version of things and the electronic version of things. So you really have an option to have something like a back and forth book, which is a very traditional way to you always have a notebook in your child's backpack. You lay out expectations that everybody's going to write in it weekly or daily, and that's going to go back and forth so that you have some information about your child's day, about their week, about what they're working on, right? And then you write in it when it comes home of what you guys are working on, and that gets sent back to the school so that everybody's on the same page. The same thing can happen for apps, and there's a ton of apps out there. I recommend that if you want an electronic version, that you really ask your case manager if they're already using a system, because a lot of times the easier that you make it for the school team to communicate with you, the more you're going to get, right? So there's a couple apps like Class Dojo and Seesaw, and I've even had parents ask for a Google Drive, a Google Doc, that's just a running resource list that everybody can share, everybody can hop in there, and they can get an update and kind of look back and forth at what's happening at home and what's happening at school. And if there needs to be any changes to that plan, then that can come up from the data that's really been kept by that written communication back and forth. So those are my favorite. I love back and forth books because of the ease of it. You can just pull it out. And then I also really love Google Docs because then you can share it with everybody. That Class Dojo and Seesaw, usually it's just the case manager that has access to that. The Google Doc is just so easy. Everybody's using it these days. It's just such an easy tool to use to go back and forth.
Yeah, I like it too, because the online versions, especially with Google Docs, because you can share them among other people, and with people moving around, like if you move to another place or a country or, that kind of stuff, you don't have to take binders of stuff. And
Yes.
the other thing about these running docs is that you can see the progress in the same doc. You don't have to flip back in, September. This is what we were talking about. And up here, this is what we're talking about. It's right there in the same document, and keeping a running project. That's why I made my second version of my workbook the 1-year record for people to keep collecting this data all along and sharing it with them. Now, I want to talk about another issue that's very common, especially on my platform. So remember, we're talking about late talkers here, and in schools, especially these early childhood programs where a lot of these kids are late talking and they're not using speech very well. There's a lot of pressure to use picture systems and PECS programs and things like that, which are not facilitating spoken language. They're facilitating communication, right? They're letting kids select what they want. They're letting them,
Get their needs met.
And they're keeping them on track with schedules and that kind of visual reminders. There's a difference between a visual cueing system and a picture program to replace talking. And I think often that gets muddied when we talk about using pictures for communication that can be very generally placed in an IEP. And then parents often feel like they're not getting who is facilitating even the spoken language. I mean, they're relying on the speech therapist one time a week to do that talking. How is the spoken language also being facilitated? What would you suggest as far as IEP inclusions? Like the actual specific things that people would put into as accommodations, I guess what we would call them.
Yes. Yep. That's where I was going to go. Yeah. So accommodations are a section in the IEP. There's really 4 key sections in the IEP that I think are most important, and accommodations are one of those 4. And in accommodations, you're just talking about the way that learning information is presented or the way that it's communicated back to the teacher, right? So you're not necessarily talking about changes to the actual curriculum. They're still learning what everybody else is learning. If you want to change any of that, that's called a modification. What we're talking about is just changing the way that it's presented and communicated back and forth. So a classic one to do to address that concern is to make sure in the accommodations that there is an accommodation that says to either cue or pair that verbal communication with whatever picture schedule or picture, I guess, system that they're using, right? Because that's going to be different for everybody.
Right.
And I do think that's really important. I think that also you can ask to make sure that that paraprofessional, if they have an aide or a paraprofessional with them, is trained in how to do that. You know, they have some training, they have a video, they have some sort of resources, which might come from the parent, in order to be able to facilitate that every single day. In the districts that I've worked at, we usually have some type of consultant that comes in to really help with those communication devices, if that's happening, because it's just so complicated of a system. And a lot of times training can be accessed through that person. So they've come in and really, you know, for example, they've come into the autism program and they've trained all of the paraprofessionals on how to use the device and also pair verbal communication with the device, how it's always supposed to be available, how you're always supposed to facilitate that so that it's always around and it's always available. So if you have a request, like, you really want to make sure that those paraprofessionals and those teachers are trained in that, because I think so many professionals are afraid of that technology, or they're afraid of the strategies. They don't exactly know what to do. Then you can ask, you can tell, of course, if that professional is just a little bit hesitant to put that accommodation in, or if they have some strong feelings against it, you can always request that they get some sort of training or some kind of, strategies or something, whatever it is, the strategies that you're using, so that you make sure that those people are trained in those strategies.
I think that's a great suggestion. And there are, in addition to the Waves of Communication platform, which is really parent friendly, there are other professionals who, Marge Blanc is the one I'm thinking about, who is doing a lot of natural language acquisition training that works for CEUs and all of that stuff that the teachers and speech pathologists need, that will equip them to do natural language modeling, because that's all we're talking about, is not abandoning the speech for the pictures, but again, including that language facilitation into the child's, because their kids are spending all day with these people. And these parents are, debating, do I send my child to a school where 5 to 6 hours a day, people are making them point to pictures and not providing them with models, or keep them home where I can provide them with language models myself and teach them my things. I think parents on my platform are really making those decisions based on, will the school be willing to help my child develop natural instead of using the ABA system or whatever is in that program. So let me just ask this, because I know we're really getting into some deep dive stuff. What happens if a parent shows up at a school, let's say, with a child who has maybe been working with me or another language, natural language, and this particular district is rigid? Because we know that there are some, right, that are not willing. I mean, the case that we're presenting, where the teachers are listening to you and everybody's accommodating and training the staff, that's ideal. We know that that's ideal. And obviously what you're asking for is win-win situations, always, but it's not always what you're presented with. If you're sitting across the team from people with sour faces that aren't willing to listen to you, and they think what you're talking about, natural language, hoo-ha, woo-wee, blah, blah, blah. We do science here. We do ABA here, evidence-based, exchange-based, blah, 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 blah. What do you suggest a parent does when they're faced with a team like that?
Yeah, I think the first step is really to come at that with your own data. And I think we keep circling back to that. We keep circling back to having your own priorities and your own vision statement for your child set up, and really having some background knowledge about what's happening so that you can bring some data to that table. Now, if you're still getting resistance, then that's when you bring in a very educated advocate or a special education lawyer to help you mediate that situation. I don't love bringing in somebody else to create conflict. That I feel like that is not in the best interest of your child. But if you are coming in with evidence and you are giving it your best shot to present why you want this specific method used, why you don't want ABA used, for example, which is becoming more and more popular, and it's still very prevalent in the schools. So it's very common that parents are trying to advocate against that, but it's so ingrained in schools right now. You might need a third party that comes in to just give fresh eyes and also just explain your rights to you. I had on my own podcast, I had a great lawyer on where she talks about just how trained lawyers are in mediation and going back and forth. So if there's a conflict that you really feel intimidated, you really feel like you're hitting a brick wall with your team, there are additional resources that you can access to help you craft that argument and really bring in more data, bring in more resources, and really explain your rights to you and how you can really fight back, because there's such a difference in power. There's a huge power dynamic between the school. There's this like huge organization. They have lawyers on staff, and then you. And I really feel like parents are going to be the grassroots change that we need in the schools. The schools are not designed for modern life at all, and especially those kids with disabilities or late talkers. It's just not set up very well. We need a change in the system. That's going to happen from parents, even though that's a very hard situation to be in as
Well,
a
and they're
parent.
in it. You're in the middle of it. You're
Yeah.
there now with your kids. What are you going to do? You got to do your best, right? No,
Mhm.
I love this because it's not going to change. We know it's not good. That's the whole reason I left. I'm not a licensed anything anymore
Yeah.
because in the system, I couldn't do it the way parents needed it done because the
Yes.
system is breaking down. But parents need it. Now,
Mhm.
I have two things I want to add to this. My
Yes.
suggestion, you talked about this vision of what the ideal educational environment is for your child.
Mhm.
My suggestion is see if that exists in the district or the
Yeah.
closest thing to it, right? And put that as your trajectory instead of trying to change a different, like your kids in the standard pre-K and they always do ABA, but there is this other alternative that some other kids have done before. That's how you get in there, right? Because
Mhm.
someone else made a precedent and
Yes.
someone else kind of did something else, or they created this other situation. And it's all they are, situations, because
Mhm.
that's what an IEP is. These those four sections: what's going on with your child, what's going on with the environment, and what do they need, what can the school provide, what is legally responsible, all of
Mhm.
that stuff comes together to make this puzzle, which is the IEP. And wow, it is a big job, but you can do it. Now,
Mhm.
I also have had parents who literally, if you cannot find in that district a place that you feel in your heart, you feel like your child's going to be safe going there, right?
Mhm.
Unless you can find that somewhere, I suggest you keep looking. Like that's
Mhm.
when you need to go. I would leave that situation before I would hire someone to change it.
Mm.
It's just not a good match. There
Yes.
are alternatives. That's what I'm going to say. There are charter
Yeah.
schools. There are private schools. There is homeschooling. There are other things. The system isn't the only way. But it has to get to pretty awful situation for you to have to leave a district. And
Yes.
I hope that more and more, that's happening less and less, I should say,
Mhm.
in the
Mhm.
world. But
Yeah.
I am kind of excited to hear that more parents are pushing back against these systemic changes that did come in. ABA got embedded, and it is a system, and it's not working for a lot of families, and they are letting people know. So, and I understand the system does work for a bunch of kids, but yeah, I think it's about your vision of what's right for your child and being able to communicate it. Isn't that what it's all about?
And I've seen parents be able to advocate. There was a student a couple of years ago who qualified for a special needs, like a significant special needs placement. And she fought back and she was like, no, this is what I want for my kid. And most of the time, I will say this too, the squeaky wheels, they get accommodated a lot. Like, I think a lot of parents are very hesitant to ask, hesitant to follow up with the school staff. I think the more that you communicate, the more you ask for things, the more you're going to get taken care of. And even if you do it in a nice way, if you just remind them.
If you're not asking for pie in the sky,
Mm-mm.
craziness, training does happen. Accommodations do happen. Kids do get more time one-on-one with
Yes.
professionals. It happens. Schools have money for it, but you get it if you have data. You get it if you know your why, and you get it
Absolutely.
if you know your kid, and you represent, right? You represent that you want to be a part of the team. You're not there expecting these people to be you. You're expecting them to help you, right?
I couldn't have put it better. That was amazing. Yes, all of that.
Yeah, because they can't be you and you can't be them. You need to have win-win, because I promise I could never have taught my kid all the stuff they learned in school. And I know that they needed support because the school didn't always support all of their emotional needs that I gave them at home. And we had to work together because school's challenging. It's hard for kids, you guys. We need to make the teachers, it's hard for teachers too.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's hard for principals. It's hard for all of this. They've got to handle a lot of kids. And that's why they have these systems and plans and stuff. But with resources like Miss Beth here has, I think that we can do it. So let's talk about your resources. We've already talked about mine because, that's what I always share. The workbook. Get the workbook, collect your data, do all of that. Let's talk about Beth's work. Tell me tell us how we can access.
Yes, so I have a couple freebies just to get people started. If you're like totally overwhelmed and you feel like you just need a little bit of information to get you started, I have two different freebies that are available on my website. One is called the IEP Parent Priority Guide, and that one is at parentfriendlyot.com/guide.
Say that slow.
Parentfriendlyot.com/guide, GUIDE. And that one gives you an eligibility map so that you can know if you have a re-eligibility coming up, you know the steps. I think that's the number one complaint that I hear most often is just the process. Like, what is coming? What can I expect? That has a process map in there, and as well as a professional's guide. So we talked earlier about the case manager. It lays out who the case manager is, what their responsibilities are, and some of the other professionals that might be on your child's team. And then just a one-page sheet that has 9 tips for IEP meetings, just to make it a little bit less stressful. And so I
love that. These are super valuable, you guys. Go to that website as soon as you're done watching this video. Go to that website and download that stuff, because you want to be prepared. You want to show up to be the one who the school says, this is the mom or dad who's got their act together. This is the one that comes prepared. This is the one that's going to help us help their kid.
And it sets the tone for the meeting. That is the exact thing to do, to just, hey, we're involved, we care. It sets a completely different tone for that meeting. And I've seen so many teams change based on the parent that shows up to the table just for that reason. They know who's involved. They know who's going to ask questions. They know who's going to ask for that draft IEP, so they can see it beforehand, so that they need to be on top of their game, and you want to be that parent, right? And then the other thing that I offer is just online courses. So I love having audio trainings and video trainings available, and those are available on my website if they want to check them out as well. But I recommend starting with the freebie. Go and get your feet wet, look at the freebie. I have a podcast that you can access to. You'll see that in my emails that you'll get after the freebie, and you can go from there and then decide if you want more information about how to advocate, or if you're okay with the freebies. That's awesome too. I'm just here to help.
Yay! I'm so glad that you joined me today. Your resources are incredibly valuable, and this is IEP season.
It is IEP season.
But especially springtime is when a
Yep.
lot of things are coming up. So this is very timely now. And yeah, definitely access her resources. And then thank you so much for joining me. Like this video, subscribe to my channel so you get more access to spotlight interviews like this one with Beth. And yeah, I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye for now. Thanks for tuning in today. With a whole range of Waves of Communication resources, from free content to customized coaching, you now have access to everything you need to elevate spoken language to infinite success. You are welcome to get your journey started with my 11-week language facilitation Journey to Speech workbook. This tool is helping parents worldwide create nonstop language facilitation opportunities that elevate spoken language beyond even their own expectations. You can access this workbook and all of the language facilitation resources on my website, wavesofcommunication.com.